On a freezing night, the river carried more than drifting ice. It carried a secret. Officer Ethan Ward and his loyal German shepherd Shadow stumbled upon a backpack snagged against the roots. Inside was not what anyone expected, but a fragile life hanging by a thread. Shadow's instincts defied every command, pulling Ethan toward a truth that would shake the town to its core. What they uncovered was not an accident, but the first piece of something far darker. Who placed the child in the river, and why watch the story unfold to discover the answer? The wind coming off the river had a way of cutting straight through the heaviest uniform. It was January in Wyoming, and the landscape lay smothered under a crust of ice and snow. Frost clung to the bare branches, the kind that cracked and shimmered like glass when the air stirred. Ethan Ward tugged his collar higher and breathed into the wool of his scarf, the fog of his breath instantly carried off by the cold. Shadow trotted a few paces ahead, paws crunching over frozen gravel. The German shepherd's coat, thick and dark, caught fragments of weak sunlight that broke through the clouded sky. His ears were sharp, his gait purposeful, every muscle in his frame tuned to the environment. For Ethan, it was a familiar rhythm, his boots following the dog's tracks, his eyes scanning the barren trees and icy banks of the Snake River. It was a routine patrol, nothing unusual. Or so Ethan thought. The river was deceptive in winter. Its surface glistened in patches where the ice had failed to take hold, water rushing beneath, with the sound of muffled thunder. Ethan paused for a moment, studying the current. He had seen the river take deer logs, even vehicles, when drivers underestimated its pull. This wasn't the sort of place you lingered. Shadow Heel, Ethan called. The dog stopped, looked back, and obeyed, at least for a moment. Then something shifted. Shadow's tail stiffened, his shoulders locked, and his head turned downstream. His body language was precise, unmistakable. Something had caught him. Ethan frowned. "What is it, boy?" Shadow didn't answer, not with sound at first. He let out a low rumble deep in his chest, neither threat nor fear. More like a warning. Ethan had known this dog long enough to understand that sound. It meant pay attention. Ethan followed Shadow's gaze. At first he saw nothing but the slate-gray churn of water. Then the current shifted, and he spotted it, a black shape bobbing near the far bank. It wasn't driftwood. The object snagged against a cluster of roots, jerked free, then snagged again. A backpack. The sight struck him oddly. Who would leave a pack out here in the middle of winter hunters-hikers? But no one in their right mind would wade into that water this time of year. Ethan pointed. "Fetch Shadow." Usually the command was enough. Shadow had charged into burning buildings, tracked suspects through storms, even pulled Ethan out of trouble more than once. Obedience was his nature. But now he didn't move. Shadow stood, rigid eyes locked on the drifting pack. His claws scraped at the frozen ground, but his paws refused the next step. "Go." Ethan barked again. Nothing. The shepherd let out another sound, a sharper growl this time, but still he didn't move. His hackles rose not in aggression, but in a posture Ethan recognized as refusal. Ethan's chest tightened. 7 years of partnership, and Shadow had never disobeyed. Not once. And now, staring at a half-sunken backpack, he was saying no. The river's mist bit at Ethan's eyes as he moved closer to the bank. Boots crunched over ice, slipped in patches of mud. The closer he got, the colder the air felt, like the water itself was leaching warmth from his skin. Then, without warning, Shadow bolted. The shepherd launched past him, body slicing into the current with barely a splash. Ethan's heart stuttered. He shouted Shadow, but the sound vanished under the roar of water. The dog swam with steady, purposeful strokes, not heading straight at the pack, but angling wide as though circling prey. Ethan ran along the bank, following his breath, burning in his lungs. Shadow looped once, then clamped his jaws gently around one of the straps. The pack was heavy. Ethan could see it in the strain of Shadow's muscles, the way his head dipped under the weight. But inch by inch, he dragged it toward shore. Ethan knelt as Shadow hauled the dripping thing onto the dirt. Water gushed from its seams, soaking into the frost. The stench of river mud and mildew rose sharply. "Good boy," Ethan muttered, reaching for the zipper. Shadow didn't relax. He stood stiff, ears pinned back, eyes never leaving the pack. Ethan unzipped it. His gloves trembled. At first, all he saw was fabric blankets, soaked and clinging. He pushed deeper, and the world seemed to tilt. Inside was a baby. An infant, tiny, wrapped so tightly in the sodden layers that for a moment Ethan couldn't tell if she was alive. Her lips were tinged blue, her skin ghostly pale. Then movement. Her eyelids fluttered. A faint sound slipped from her mouth, a cry so thin it barely reached the air. "Jesus," Ethan whispered. His pulse roared in his ears. He scooped her out, cradling her against his chest, careful not to jostle the fragile body. She weighed almost nothing. He ripped off his jacket, wrapping her as tightly as he dared, pressing her close to his own warmth. "Dispatch. This is Officer Ward," he barked into his radio, his voice unsteady. "Urgent EMS request. Mile marker 216 on the Snake River. I've got a live infant. Breathing but weak. Severe cold exposure." Static crackled. Then a reply confirmed units were en route. Ethan looked down at the bundle in his arms. The baby's chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate motions. Her fingers twitched against the fabric. She was fighting. Shadow shook himself, dry water spraying in a glitter of droplets. He was still trembling, but his gaze was fixed on the backpack, as though it carried more than what they'd found. Ethan followed his dog's stare. Inside the bag, beneath the blankets, something else glimmered. He reached back, fingers brushing a small bracelet, stitched with faded pink thread. The word sewn into it was nearly illegible, but he could make out the letters, Hope. He also pulled out a photograph, water-damaged and torn, half the image eaten away. What remained was the blurred outline of a young woman holding a newborn. Her face was only half visible, but her eyes, what survived of them, looked exhausted. The baby in Ethan's arms whimpered. The sound pierced the winter quiet like a prayer. "Hold on," Ethan murmured, rocking her gently. "Just hold on." The ambulance arrived minutes later, siren muffled by the snow-heavy air. Paramedics swarmed, lifting the baby into their care, checking vitals, wrapping her in heated blankets. Ethan stepped back, jacket-soaked, hands still shaking. Shadow leaned against his leg, silent. The shepherd's coat was damp, his body shivering from the icy plunge. Ethan rested a hand on his partner's head. "You knew," he whispered. "You knew there was more in that bag than just weight." The baby's faint cry echoed from inside the ambulance as doors slammed shut. Tires crunched over ice as the vehicle pulled away, lights painting the gray sky red and blue. For a long moment, Ethan stood by the riverbank, staring at the place where the backpack had bobbed. The current moved on indifferent, as though it had never carried such a fragile secret. But Ethan knew better. This wasn't coincidence, not in the dead of winter, not on a river known to swallow what it touched. Someone had placed that child there, wrapped tight in a pack, trusting, or perhaps hoping that the water would decide her fate. Shadow huffed beside him, tail brushing the ground once, then falling still. Ethan exhaled the air sharp in his throat. "All right, boy," he said softly. "Looks like we've just started something bigger than us." The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, a sterile contrast to the storm that still raged in Ethan Ward's chest. He paced the corridor just outside the emergency ward, his boots leaving wet tracks on the linoleum from the river mud still clinging to them. His jacket was gone, wrapped tightly around the baby until the paramedics had taken her, but he didn't feel the cold. Not anymore. The baby. Grace. He hadn't spoken her name aloud yet, but it was already what he called her in his mind. Grace, because survival like that was nothing short of grace itself. Officer Ward, he turned. A nurse in her 40s approached her presence, steadying. Clara Jensen, her ID badge, read it clearly, though Ethan already knew her from past runs to the county hospital. She had the sort of calm that years of triage carved into a person, the kind that could anchor chaos with a single word. "She's stable," Clara said. "Still critical, but we've managed to get her warmed. Vitals are climbing. She's a fighter." Relief cracked through Ethan's chest like thawing ice. His shoulders sagged, and he exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. You can see her in a bit," Clara cut in gently. "Right now she needs the machines more than she needs company." "But," Clara's gaze softened, "what you and your partner did tonight, there's no other word for it. Miraculous." Ethan glanced down at Shadow, who lay at his feet, his damp coat already drying in the heat of the building. The shepherd's eyes were half closed, but his ears still twitched at every sound. He never truly slept on duty. "Miraculous, maybe," Ethan muttered, "but not an accident." Clara tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Ethan crouched, unzipping the heavy black backpack that sat by his side. He hadn't let it out of sight since the river. Its canvas was still damp, its zipper stiff from the cold. Inside, nestled beneath where Grace had been swaddled, were the remnants of something more personal. He pulled out the small bracelet first. The thread was pink once, now dulled to a faded rose by water and time. Tiny letters stitched in clumsy, heartfelt effort spelled a single word, hope. The string was fraying, but intact enough to carry meaning. Clara touched her throat. Her voice hushed. "A baby bracelet." Ethan nodded. Somebody made this for her, with care. This wasn't trash thrown in a river. It meant something. Next, he drew out the photograph. The edges were warped, the image blurred. Moisture had eaten away at most of it, but one corner remained intact. A young woman stared back a newborn in her arms. Her smile was faint, strained, as though it cost her to hold it. Half her face was lost to damage the paper burned by water stains, but the surviving eye carried exhaustion and something else. Desperation. Clara leaned closer. "Do you know her?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "Not yet, but we will." He slipped the items into an evidence bag, sealing them with practiced precision. But the act felt heavier than routine. This wasn't just procedure. It was a promise. Behind the ward's doors, Grace's fragile cry carried faintly like a thread of sound trying to tie itself back into life. The sound struck Ethan deep. He had been in this job long enough to know the usual patterns of cruelty, abandonment, recklessness, desperation. But nothing about this felt ordinary. Shadow lifted his head, watching Ethan with steady, unblinking eyes. "You knew," Ethan murmured. He rubbed the shepherd's ear fingers, brushing damp fur. "You wouldn't touch the bag at first. You sensed it. This isn't just neglect, it's more. The memory of Shadow refusing the command at the river replayed in Ethan's mind. That refusal had saved a life. Instinct had told the dog that inside the heavy waterlogged pack wasn't just burden, but something that demanded reverence, a secret too fragile to drag without care. Ethan stood shoulders stiffening as duty reasserted itself. I need to file a report, and we're going to run that photo through the database. The precinct was nearly empty when Ethan returned. Midnight had long passed, leaving the halls hollow except for the hum of vending machines and the occasional shuffle of a night shift officer. He dropped the backpack onto his desk with a dull thud. Shadow lay nearby, stretched out but alert. Ethan set the bracelet and the photo under the glow of his desk lamp. The bracelet glimmered faintly, the letters Hope catching the light. He could almost see a young mother stitching them thread between fingers, each knot tied with intent. The photo was harder to look at. He scanned it carefully, noting the half-smile, the tired eye. A woman too young, perhaps early 20s. Long hair maybe brown, though the colors had washed away. He fed the photo into the scanner, adjusting the settings to salvage whatever detail the damage hadn't destroyed. On the screen, the image sharpened slightly, enough to reveal a faint name written on the back in smudged ink, Lila Hart. The letters curled with hesitation, as though scribbled quickly. But it was a name nonetheless. Lila Hart, Ethan said aloud. The syllables carried weight, as though speaking them tethered the baby upstairs to a larger truth. He logged into the state database, fingers tapping keys with measured speed. The system churned, pulling records from hospitals' licenses, social services. A hit blinked on the screen. Hart Lila, age 22. Admitted to Jackson Memorial 3 days ago. Postpartum. Discharged against medical advice. Ethan's pulse quickened. She had walked out of the hospital. No paperwork, no official escort, just vanished into the night with a newborn. And hours later, that newborn ended up zipped inside a backpack in a freezing river. Ethan leaned back, running a hand over his face. The story didn't add up. Shadow huffed the sound sharp in the quiet. Yeah, Ethan muttered. I smell it too. This isn't a simple abandonment. Something pushed her. He printed the record, stapled it to the evidence log, and leaned over his desk. For a moment, fatigue threatened him. But then Grace's faint cry replayed in his memory, and he straightened. This wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning. At dawn, Ethan returned to the hospital. Clara met him outside the pediatric unit. She made it through the night, Clara said softly. Her smile was faint but real. She's small, she's fragile, but she's holding on. We've been calling her Baby Grace. Ethan felt something tug at his chest. Grace, he repeated. That's her name then. Clara touched his arm. She'll go into protective custody until the situation is clearer, but she wouldn't even be here if not for you and Shadow. Ethan shook his head. Not me. Him. He glanced at Shadow, who stood watchful by the door. The shepherd's posture was calm, but alert, like a sentinel guarding a secret. Inside the ward, Grace slept in a bassinet under the warm glow of heat lamps, her tiny chest rising and falling. The sight anchored Ethan's resolve. Somewhere, a young woman named Lila Hart had walked away from a hospital with this child in her arms. Somewhere, decisions had been made, desperate, dangerous decisions, and somewhere a shadow still lingered over the truth. Ethan knew what his next steps were. The photograph, the bracelet, the name. Every thread was a trail waiting to be followed. He rested a hand on Shadow's neck. Let's find her, he whispered. The precinct's surveillance room was dim, lit only by the pale glow of monitors stacked in rows. Screens flickered with traffic footage, frozen frames of snowy highways, the silent sweep of security feeds capturing moments no one noticed in real time. Ethan Ward leaned forward in the stiff-backed chair, elbows on his knees, eyes narrowed at the screen in front of him. Shadow lay sprawled at his feet, silent and steady, but his ears twitched at every rustle and hum. The timestamp on the corner of the video read 5:42 a.m., 28 minutes before the 911 call had been placed. The bridge came into view, its skeletal frame etched against a pale winter dawn. Snow dusted the railings, and the river below churned black and restless. Headlights appeared. Ethan froze the frame. The glow illuminated the edges of a late-model SUV, silver boxy, maybe 5 or 6 years old. He adjusted the zoom, but the camera was old, the resolution grainy. The vehicle rolled to a stop near the middle of the bridge, idled, then shut its lights off. "Why stop there?" Ethan muttered. His voice carried more to Shadow than anyone else. He pressed play again. A figure stepped out. The person lingered in the shadows cast by the railing's shape, obscured by distance and darkness. Ethan leaned closer, squinting. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a heavy coat flapping in the wind. He moved slowly, deliberately around the side of the SUV. He paused at the railing, gazed down toward the water, then disappeared from the camera's angle. Ethan's pulse quickened. When the figure returned minutes later, his arms hung oddly, as if he had carried something. He slid back into the driver's seat, headlights flashing to life, and the SUV rolled away, vanishing into the snow-laced darkness. Ethan sat back, jaw tightening. "That wasn't Lila," he said aloud. "She's smaller. This guy, he's a wall." Shadow raised his head, eyes locked on the screen, ears pricked. He gave a quiet rumble, the same sound he'd made on the riverbank before diving into the freezing water. Ethan rewound the footage, played it again and again. The resolution blurred details, the man's face stayed hidden, his plates unreadable. But the intent was clear. Whoever he was, he'd been there before the backpack was found. And the backpack hadn't floated there on its own. By late morning, the investigation had shifted. What began as a miracle rescue was now a case of attempted homicide or something equally sinister. Ethan sat across from Detective Maya Torres in the precinct briefing room. A fresh pot of coffee steamed between them, its bitter aroma thick in the stale air. Maya, younger by a decade, but sharp as a blade, tapped her pen against the report in front of her. Her dark hair was tied back, her expression unreadable. "So let me get this straight," she said. "We've got a 22-year-old mother, Lila Hart. Checked into Jackson Memorial 3 days ago, postpartum, discharged herself against medical advice. No official escort, no follow-up. She just left. Then this morning, her newborn daughter ends up zipped inside a backpack in the Snake River." "Correct," Ethan said. "And instead of a panicked mother making a mistake, we've got footage of a man, not her, stopping on the bridge minutes before the rescue. Big guy, heavy coat, hides his face. Doesn't exactly scream coincidence." Ethan nodded grimly. "No coincidence. He put that backpack there." Maya leaned back, sighing through her teeth. "So where does that leave Lila?" "That's the question." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. She could be complicit, but the hospital file suggests otherwise. Nurses noted bruises on her arms and face. One even wrote that she seemed afraid, kept glancing at the door like someone was waiting. Maya's brow furrowed. "Abuse case?" "Likely. Maybe she ran because she thought she wasn't safe. Maybe someone followed." Ethan slid the blurry still from the surveillance footage across the table. Whoever this guy is, he's part of it. And I'd bet he's the reason Grace almost didn't survive the night. Maya studied the printout. So this isn't abandonment. It's an attempted cover-up. Maybe worse. Shadow huffed from the corner, shifting his weight. His golden brown eyes never left the grainy figure on the page, as if he recognized the shape, even through blur. Exactly, Ethan said. Later, Ethan stood outside the hospital again, the winter sun doing little to warm the air. He stared through the glass into the pediatric wing, where baby Grace, swaddled now in fresh blankets, lay sleeping in a clear bassinet. Machines beeped steadily, marking her fragile progress. Clara Jensen joined him at the window. "She's stronger today," she said quietly. "Her temperature is back within range, but she's still under observation." "She'll make it," Ethan said firmly, more to himself than anyone. Clara glanced at him. "What about the mother?" Ethan's jaw set. "We're trying to find her. Her name is Lila Hart. You've never seen her here." Clara shook her head. "No. But if she left with injuries and no support, she might be in hiding. Or worse." Ethan exhaled, fogging the glass. His reflection blurred over the image of the infant. One way or another, we're going to get answers. Grace didn't end up in that river by chance. That evening, Ethan sat alone at his desk again. Shadow lay nearby, chin resting on his paws. The precinct was quiet, just the distant murmur of radios and the occasional shuffle of boots in the hall. He opened the evidence bag once more, sliding the photograph out carefully. The woman Lila Hart stared back at him, or at least the half of her face the water hadn't erased. He traced the faint outlines of her tired smile, the newborn cradled in her arms. He wondered what moment that photo had captured. Pride, fear, both. A knock at the door broke his focus. Sheriff Whitaker stepped in, broad and weathered with lines etched deep from years of hard decisions. He carried authority like a mantle, heavy but steady. "Ward," the sheriff said, "you've stirred something bigger than you realize. Media's already sniffing around. But this isn't just a good news rescue story anymore. It's an open case." "I know," Ethan said. Whitaker studied him for a long moment. "You've got instincts, and that dog of yours, hell, half the town already thinks he's a miracle. But tread carefully. If there's a man behind this, he won't like that we're digging." Ethan met his eyes. "That man already tried to erase a child. I'm not backing down." Whitaker gave a small nod. "Then follow it, but don't do it alone." When the sheriff left, Ethan sat back, the weight of the words sinking in. He glanced at Shadow. "You hear that?" he asked softly. "We've got work to do." Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor, quiet but certain. The next morning, Ethan returned to the bridge. Snow had fallen overnight, coating the road in a thin white blanket. He parked the cruiser at the shoulder and stepped out, boots crunching. Shadow followed, nose low to the ground, tail stiff with purpose. The railing where the SUV had stopped still bore faint scuff marks, shoes, maybe boots, grinding against the frost. Ethan crouched, brushing snow aside, uncovering a dark smear. Oil grease blood. He couldn't tell, but he scraped it into a sample vial. Shadow sniffed the air, then padded toward the edge of the bridge. He froze, ears forward, muscles taut. He gave a sharp bark, then looked back at Ethan. "What is it, boy?" The dog leaned over the rail, nose twitching. Ethan followed his gaze. Below, the river churned endlessly, but clinging to the roots where the backpack had snagged was another scrap fabric torn, caught like a flag. Ethan's heart raced as he climbed down carefully icy wood slick beneath his gloves. He reached the roots, tugged the fabric free. It was part of a hospital gown, soaked, stained, torn at the seam. Lila's. He clutched it in his fist, the weight of realization pressing down. She had been here. Maybe forced. Maybe left behind. This wasn't abandonment. This was pursuit. He scrambled back up, Shadow's eyes tracking his every move. Ethan held the scrap up. "She was here," he said, breath clouding in the frozen air. "She didn't leave that baby. Someone else did." Shadow growled low, a sound like thunder rolling in his chest. Snow had begun falling again by the time Ethan Ward pulled into the county lot, his cruiser tires crunching over packed ice. The day had been a blur of reports interviews and long silences, broken only by the faint hum of heaters in the precinct. But now, just after sunset, the case cracked open with a ping from the state's credit card monitoring system. He was still at his desk when the alert flashed across his laptop. Lila Hart card, activity 2 hours prior. Location, a rural gas station 40 miles south of town. Ethan's pulse surged. After days of uncertainty there, it was a trail. He grabbed his coat, slung it over one shoulder, and whistled sharply. Shadow rose instantly, shaking off Sleep Tail, stiff with readiness. Together they moved, fast boots echoing through the quiet hallway as they cut toward the lot. Within minutes, the cruiser's engine growled to life, headlights slicing through the thickening snow. Ethan keyed the radio as he pulled onto the dark highway. "Dispatch Officer Ward, I've got a ping on Hart's card. Rural station Route 87 timestamp 2 hours back. Heading there now with Shadow. Request backup on standby. Copy that, dispatch answered. Stay safe, Ward. Weather's turning." The warning was an understatement. Snow lashed across the windshield, each gust slanting harder than the last. Ethan flicked on the high beams, but visibility barely stretched beyond 50 feet. The road wound narrow and slick through open plains, black trees bowing under the weight of winter. Shadow braced himself on the passenger seat, eyes sharp, body steady against the swerves. Ethan glanced at him once. "You feel it too, don't you?" The shepherd's ears twitched, but his gaze never left the road ahead. The gas station appeared like a mirage, a lone outpost against the storm. A single flickering light buzzed above the pumps, casting the snow in jittering yellow. Inside, through fogged windows, Ethan could see the faint outline of a clerk hunched over a counter. He parked at the far edge of the lot, killed the engine, and stepped out into the cutting wind. Shadow leapt down, silently pause, sinking into the drift. Together they crossed toward the entrance, Ethan's boots sinking his breath, forming clouds in the frigid night. A bell chimed as he pushed open the door. The warmth inside hit like a wave, smelling faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. The young woman behind the counter looked up startled until Ethan flashed his badge. "Evening, ma'am. Officer Ward, County Sheriff's Department. I need to ask you a few questions." Her eyes widened. She set down her phone, straightening nervously. "Sure. What's going on?" "About 2 hours ago, Ethan said a woman may have come through here. Early 20s, pale, maybe bruised, might have seemed shaken." The clerk blinked, then nodded quickly. "Yeah, she was here." Hood pulled up, lip was cut. She bought gas, a bottle of baby formula, and some trail mix. Barely spoke, just kept looking over her shoulder. Ethan's jaw tightened. Was she alone? The girl hesitated. She came in by herself. But she kept glancing outside like she was afraid someone would follow. Ethan leaned in. "Did you see any vehicles when she left Silver Honda?" The girl said immediately. "Two-door Wyoming plates. I didn't catch the number. She pulled out fast like she was being chased. Camera working." "Yeah, it covers the pumps." Minutes later, Ethan was in the back office, the glow of the old monitor casting his face in cold light. The footage rolled grainy but clear enough. There was Lila Hood, drawn shoulders hunched, her movements jittery. She filled the tank, stole quick glances over her shoulder, and opened the trunk, briefly rummaging before slamming it shut. Then movement in the far corner of the frame. Ethan froze the video, leaning close. A second figure lingered at the edge of the building, half shrouded in shadow. A man. Tall, bearded, military-style coat. Watching. Waiting. Shadow growled low beside him, the sound vibrating through the cramped room. Ethan whispered the name that slid into his gut like ice. Caleb Stone. The man Lila had feared. The one the hospital notes had hinted at, but never named. The footage flickered. Lila's Honda peeled out of the lot. Seconds later, the shadowed man moved to the far side of the frame. He didn't follow immediately, but Ethan could read the intent in the posture. A predator biding time. Snow had grown into a full storm by the time Ethan left the station. Flakes whipped across the windshield, the wind keening like a blade drawn against stone. He radioed the update, his voice clipped. Dispatch, confirm visual of Hart at Route 87 station, accompanied indirectly by male subject possible, Caleb Stone. Vehicle silver Honda Wyoming plates. Suspect potentially trailing. I'm pursuing toward Bitter Creek Reserve. Request highway cams for confirmation. Copy that, Ward. Conditions are rough. Proceed with caution. The cruiser roared back onto the highway wipers, straining against the blinding white. Shadow braced against the dashboard, head-lifted nostrils flaring at the crack in the window. Bitter Creek. The name itself carried weight, an expanse of forest cliffs and abandoned ranger cabins. Few ventured there in winter, which meant if Lila was driven that way, she wasn't going by choice. Miles blurred under the steady rhythm of tires against ice. Then dispatch came through. Camera hit. Silver Honda entered Bitter Creek Access Road 20 minutes ago. No return sighting. Ethan's grip tightened on the wheel. Then that's where we're going, he muttered. The access road wound narrow, bordered by pines heavy with snow. The storm reduced visibility to a tunnel of white headlights straining against the curtain. Ethan slowed tires, skidding at each bend. Shadow stood on the console, paws braced, eyes locked ahead. His ears flicked, catching something Ethan couldn't hear. The shepherd let out a low whine, then a sharp bark staring at the tree line. What is it, boy? Ethan slowed, further scanning. Tire tracks, faint but visible, veering off onto a smaller trail, too narrow for the cruiser. He killed the engine, the sudden silence pressing against his ears. Snowflakes hissed against his jacket as he stepped out, flashlight in hand. Let's work, he told Shadow. The shepherd bolted ahead, nose low, tail stiff. Ethan followed, boots crunching, breath harsh in the storm. The trail cut deep into the forest branches, heavy with snow, bowing low over the path. Each step pulled them further into the dark heart of Bitter Creek. 10 minutes in Shadow froze. His body stiffened, ears forward, eyes locked. A low growl rumbled from his chest. Ethan swung his flashlight. Through the trees, barely visible beneath an overhang of rock and pine, sat a silver Honda, half frosted over. The car was silent, windows dark. Ethan crouched low, signaling Shadow to stay. The shepherd obeyed, though his body trembled with restrained tension. Ethan moved in wide, circling heart, hammering in his chest. Snowflakes stung his face, breath catching in the icy air. He raised his voice, steady but firm. Lila Hart. This is Officer Ward. I'm not here to hurt you. I found your daughter. She's safe. Silence. Then the faint creak of a car door. The driver's side opened slowly. A figure emerged, arms wrapped around herself, trembling more from fear than cold. Hood pulled back, her face came into the beam of Ethan's light. Pale, bruised, eyes bloodshot and raw. Lila Hart. She clutched her coat tighter, lips parting. Her voice was barely a whisper, but Ethan caught it. You found her." Ethan lowered his flashlight, his voice softening. "Yes, Grace is safe. Warm. She's going to be okay." Lila's shoulders shook. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, vanishing into the snow. But before Ethan could move closer, Shadow stiffened again. His body dropped, low teeth flashing in the beam of light. His growl cut sharp, vibrating through the storm. Ethan swung the flashlight wide. There at the tree line stood a man. Tall, broad, beard thick against the cold, military coat drawn tight. Caleb Stone. His eyes gleamed from the shadows locked on Lila like a predator reclaiming prey. Ethan raised his voice loud against the storm. "Stone, stay where you are." But Caleb only smiled faintly, a shape more than an expression, and melted back into the trees. The forest swallowed him whole. Shadow lunged, barking furiously, straining against Ethan's command. Ethan gritted his teeth, adrenaline surging. The hunt wasn't over, not by a long shot. And now in the depths of Bitter Creek, the game had only begun. The forest swallowed sound as easily as it swallowed light. Snow fell heavier now, flakes thick and wet, muffling every step Ethan Ward took. The beam of his flashlight cut only a narrow tunnel through the trees, illuminating shadows that seemed to shift as the storm deepened. Shadow padded beside him, body low, hackles raised. Behind them, Lila Hart stumbled, clutching her coat around her thin frame, her breath sharp bursts of fear in the frozen air. They had made it barely half a mile from the Honda when the tracks appeared fresh, heavy boot prints, angling away into the woods. Ethan crouched, brushing snow away from one impression. "Broad, deep, deliberate. Caleb," he muttered. Lila froze, eyes wide. "He's here." Ethan looked back at her, voice firm. "He's not going to touch you. Or Grace." She shivered, hugging herself tighter, but nodded faintly. Shadow growled, nose pressed to the ground, body taut with intent. The dog didn't need orders. He knew the trail. Ethan rose. Flashlight's steady sidearm loosened in its holster, but not yet drawn. The woods pressed in around them, branches heavy with snow, silence broken only by the distant creak of settling trees. The cabin appeared suddenly a dark silhouette against the storm. Its roof sagged under years of neglect, chimney-cracked boards warped with rot. But smoke rose faintly from a fire pit outside the door, curling against the wind, like a whisper of occupation. Ethan motioned Lila back. "Stay here. Don't move unless I tell you." Her eyes darted to the cabin, fear raw in every line of her face. But she nodded, pressing herself against the trunk of a pine. Ethan signaled Shadow. The shepherd slipped ahead, moving silent, as breath paused, crunching just enough for Ethan to follow. Together, they closed the distance. Through a crack in the broken wall, Ethan saw movement. Caleb Stone sat cross-legged on the floor, a duffel bag beside him. His thick coat was open beard, frosted with ice. In his hands, he cleaned something metal. Ethan's stomach tightened. A handgun. He whispered low, steady, the way he'd trained himself for moments like this. "All right, boy. On my mark." He stepped forward, voice loud enough to carry. "Caleb Stone Sheriff's Department. You're surrounded. Put the weapon down and come out slowly." Inside Caleb's head snapped up. The duffel tipped, spilling half-packed supplies onto the floor. The gun clattered as he grabbed for it, fury twisting his face. "You're not taking me!" His voice cut through the cabin like a blade. She lied. "That baby ain't mine." Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger, but he held. "Don't do this, Stone. Put the gun down." For a heartbeat, silence hung thick. Then Caleb stepped into the doorway, weapon raised. Now Shadow. The shepherd lunged. It happened in a blur, snow exploding from the ground, Caleb's arm jerking as Shadow's body slammed into him, teeth snapping inches from flesh. The gun fired once, the shot muffled by the storm bullet, tearing harmlessly into a tree. Caleb fell hard back, striking the frozen dirt weapon knocked from his grip. Ethan was there in seconds, boots pounding, cuffs snapping cold around Caleb's wrists. Shadow pinned the man's chest, snarling jaws poised close enough to remind him how little room he had left. "You're under arrest," Ethan said coldly. "Attempted homicide, child endangerment, violation of a protection order. And that's just the start." Caleb spat snow clinging to his beard. "You don't know anything. She's crazy. She'll say anything." Ethan yanked him to his feet. "Save it for court." The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and coffee, its paneled walls echoing with the low murmur of voices. Sunlight filtered through high windows muted by frost, casting narrow beams across rows of benches filled with townsfolk, reporters, and officials. On the front table, evidence sat neatly stacked, the backpack, the torn photograph, the tiny bracelet with pink thread spelling hope. Ethan Ward stood near the back, Shadow at his side, the shepherd sitting tall and quiet, his dark coat glistening under the lights. The town had shown up for this hearing in ways Ethan hadn't expected. They filled every bench, leaned against every wall, craned their necks for a glimpse of the young woman at the center of it all, Lila Hart. Lila looked smaller than the room. Her hands were clasped on her lap, knuckles pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but clear. She sat between her attorney and Detective Maya Torres, who had chosen to be present in quiet support. When the judge entered, voices hushed. Papers rustled, gavels echoed. The case was called the matter of the state versus Lila Hart. Charges had been heavy at the start: child endangerment, abandonment. But as evidence poured in the hospital records, witness testimonies, Caleb Stone's threats, those charges had shifted. The story that emerged was not of a negligent mother, but of one trapped, cornered, making a desperate gamble to save her child from a man who had terrorized her. Maya leaned close, speaking softly enough that only Lila heard. "You're stronger than you think. Today isn't the end, it's your beginning." Lila gave a faint nod, her lips trembling, eyes flicking once toward Ethan at the back of the room. He met her gaze, steady, silent, and inclined his head just enough to tell her she wasn't alone. The prosecution spoke first, outlining the bare facts: an infant placed in a river, discovered in conditions that could have been fatal. But their case carried less fire than before. Evidence of coercion. Caleb's violent past and the hospital's documented warnings had dulled the weight of their accusations. The defense followed. Lila's attorney, calm and deliberate, spoke not of excuses, but of circumstances. He painted the picture of a woman bruised and broken, stalked and threatened, forced into impossible decisions. She did not abandon her child, he said firmly. She entrusted her survival to chance because every other path was barred. She believed someone would find her before he could. When Lila was called to the stand, the room held its breath. Her voice wavered at first, but steadied as she spoke. She described the hospital room, the shadows under the door, the figure of Caleb waiting in the hallway. She described the fear of his words the nights he followed her, the threats whispered in her ear. And finally she described the bridge, the storm, the moment she believed the river was her only chance to outpace him. Tears streaked down her face as she whispered, "I never wanted to let her go. I wanted her safe. That's all I wanted." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the scratching of pens across paper. The judge leaned forward, his voice steady but tinged with humanity. The court does not condone what you did. But the court also recognizes the difference between malice and desperation. The charges of abandonment are dismissed. You will remain under supervision as custody decisions are finalized. But you are not a criminal, Ms. Hart. You are a mother who was cornered by violence. The gavel struck once. Gasps, then murmurs rippled through the room. Lila lowered her head into her hands, shoulders shaking. Maya reached over, steadying her with a hand on her back. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, relief washing through him. Hours later in the pediatric ward, the reunion came quietly. Grace lay in her bassinet, small but stronger, her cheeks tinged with healthy color now. Machines hummed softly around her. Clara Jensen stood nearby, clipboard in hand, watching as Lila entered the room under the careful eye of social workers. For a moment, Lila froze at the threshold. She looked younger than her years, frail, trembling, as though afraid the sight of her child would shatter her. "Go on," Maya whispered beside her. "She's waiting." Lila stepped forward. Shadow padded in silently, positioning himself near the door like a sentinel, his golden eyes steady. Ethan leaned against the wall, arms folded, keeping his presence quiet but strong. Lila reached the bassinet, her fingers trembling as she brushed Grace's tiny hand. The infant stirred, eyes fluttering, open mouth, shaping a soft sound. And just like that, the years of fear broke. Lila bent forward, gathering Grace gently into her arms, pressing her face into the soft blanket. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "I'm here. I'm here, my sweet girl. I won't let him take you again." Grace shifted her fragile body, curling into her mother's warmth, as though she recognized it. Clara's eyes glistened as she scribbled on her chart. "She knows her scent," she murmured. She settled the moment her mother held her. The room was silent, except for Lila's quiet sobs and the steady hum of machines. Maya stood close, voice low. "You're not broken, Lila. You survived. And now you get to stand up not just for yourself, but for her." Lila nodded faintly, still holding her daughter like a lifeline. Word spread through town faster than winter wind. The baby had lived. The mother was free. The monster was caught. And through it all, one figure emerged, larger than life. Shadow. Photographs of the shepherd hit local papers, ears pricked, amber eyes keen, his body poised beside Ethan at the courthouse steps. Headlines called him Hero Dog the Canine, who had refused an order and saved a life. Children painted signs with paw prints, classrooms wrote letters, and by week's end a mural of Shadow appeared on the side of the town's firehouse. Ethan endured the attention with weary patience, but Shadow seemed to take it in stride. At public events he sat calm as children pressed treats into his mouth-tail, thumping gently as if to say, "This is fine, but I'd rather be working." "Looks like you're famous," Ethan muttered one evening as Shadow sprawled by the fireplace, a plaque from the mayor propped on the mantel. Shadow blinked slowly, unimpressed, then closed his eyes. Yet beneath the celebration, Ethan's mind kept circling back to the unanswered. The SUV on the bridge, the way Caleb had appeared silent, patient, waiting in shadows, the torn photo of Lila, waterlogged but lingering, and something else. The way Shadow had refused the command that night, not out of fear, but out of instinct, as though he had known the danger wasn't just the river, but the hands that had placed the child there. Ethan stared out the precinct window late one night, snow falling thick across the quiet town. His reflection looked back at him in the glass, tired eyes, jaw set, lines deepened by sleepless nights. Shadow lay at his feet, ears twitching in half-sleep. "There are pieces missing," Ethan murmured to the dark. "Things that don't fit." Lila's story explains part of it. But not all. The shepherd stirred, lifting his head, eyes glowing faint in the lamplight. He tilted his head as though he too felt the invisible thread stretching beyond their reach. Ethan crouched, resting a hand on Shadow's neck. "We're not done." "Are we?" Shadow pressed against his palm, silent. And in that silence, Ethan felt the truth settle heavy in his chest. Grace was safe. Lila was free. Caleb Stone was behind bars. The snow outside had softened into quiet drifts, muffling the small town into a deceptive calm. Ethan Ward sat at his kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee untouched before him. Shadow lay sprawled across the rug chest, rising steadily, eyes half-lidded in the kind of rest that was never fully sleep. The knock came just after dawn. 3 short raps against the door, measured deliberate. Ethan frowned, rising carefully. Few people came to his house without calling first. When he opened the door, no one stood there. Only the empty porch, dusted in snow, his front yard stretching into silence. But on the welcome mat lay a single envelope, white against the dark wood, the flap sealed but edges damp from frost. He bent, picking it up. No return address, no markings, only 2 words scrawled across the front in a careful hand for Shadow. Ethan's stomach tightened. He glanced down. Shadow had already risen, ears, pricked eyes locked on the envelope, as though it radiated something only he could sense. "You've got mail," Ethan muttered, unease threading his voice. He carried it inside, laying it gently on the table. Shadow followed tail, low posture, alert. Together they regarded it as though the thing might move. Ethan tore it open. Inside lay a single Polaroid photograph. A little girl no more than 6 stared back at him. Her dark hair hung limp to her shoulders, her cheeks, pale lips pressed into a silence too heavy for someone so young. She clutched a stuffed bear, its fur worn, one ear missing. The background showed little more than weathered siding and a cluster of trees, but the image carried weight. On the back, scrawled in blocky letters, was a single line. "She hasn't spoken in months." No name, no sender, nothing else. Ethan turned the photo over again, staring at the child's eyes. Sadness lived there, but more than that distance, the way trauma built walls too high for words to cross. He exhaled slowly. "Who are you, kid?" Shadow stood with his paws on the table, nose pressed near the photo. He let out a quiet whine tail, twitching. "You feel it too." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. The room suddenly felt colder. "Someone wanted you to see this." "Not me, you." That envelope wasn't addressed to Ethan Ward. It was for Shadow. The shepherd blinked, amber eyes glinting in the early light. Ethan rose, pacing the photo clutched in his hand. He'd seen plenty of anonymous tips before, but this was different. It was personal, deliberate. Whoever sent it had gone out of their way to bypass the system, to put the weight directly onto them. And the detail, it wasn't just a warning. It was a plea. She hasn't spoken in months. That wasn't just information. That was desperation. At the precinct later that morning, Ethan spread the photo across the desk under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. Detective Maya Torres leaned over his shoulder, brow furrowed. "Another child," she murmured. "Looks like it," Ethan replied. "No name, no sender. Just this photo and that line. Maya picked it up carefully. Where do you think it was taken? Look behind her. Ethan tapped the background. Not much, but see the trees. That's not our county. Pine like that taller, denser, older growth. That's Morgan County territory. About an hour east. Maya sighed. So whoever sent this knows you'll chase it. Knows Shadow will. Ethan's voice was grim. Maya gave him a sidelong glance. Ward, you sure this isn't some prank people know what Shadow did? Hero Dog saves a baby, whole town's talking. Could be someone messing with you. Ethan shook his head firmly. No, this isn't a prank. Whoever she is, she's real, and someone wants her found. Maya studied him a moment longer, then nodded reluctantly. All right, I'll cover things here. But if you're going into Morgan County, take backup. Don't do this solo. Ethan gave a thin smile. Not solo. I've got Shadow. The drive east cut through frozen fields and low hills, the highway flanked by snow-draped pines. The storm had broken, leaving a hard blue sky and sunlight sharp enough to make the drifts glitter. Ethan kept the photo clipped to the dash, glancing at it often. The girl's eyes haunted him. Not just fear, but silence, the kind forced on a child. He'd seen it before. Kids who stopped speaking not because they couldn't, but because their world had told them no one would listen. Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, nose pressed near the crack of the window ears, shifting at every scent. Ethan reached over, brushing the shepherd's neck absently. This one's for you, partner, he said quietly. Let's find her. Morgan County was older country. Tall timberlands, narrow dirt roads, scattered farmhouses clinging to life against the cold. Ethan stopped at the sheriff's office first, flashing the photo across the counter. The deputy on duty squinted, rubbing his chin. Haven't seen her. Doesn't mean she ain't here. We've got plenty of kids out this way. Some homeschooled, some off the grid. Folks keep to themselves. Ethan's jaw tightened. You see a kid like this, you let me know. He left dissatisfied. But Shadow was restless tail lashing as they stepped back into the sharp air. The shepherd sniffed the photo again, then tugged the leash toward the edge of town, toward the timber. All right, Ethan muttered, following. Lead on. They drove deeper into the county, where paved roads turned to gravel and gravel to dirt. The forest's thickened branches knitting overhead light, dimming. Shadow grew tense, pacing the seat nose pressed to the glass. Ethan slowed as they passed an old farmhouse, siding gray and warped roof sagging under snow. A swing set leaned crooked in the yard, its chain's rusted seat buried. Shadow whined, pawing at the window. Ethan pulled over. The house was silent. No smoke from the chimney, no sign of movement. But in the backyard, near the sagging fence, a cluster of trees leaned together, branches twisted into familiar shapes. He pulled the photo from the dash, holding it up. The match wasn't perfect, but close. Same siding. Same trees. This is it, Ethan whispered. Shadow barked once, sharp and certain. Ethan drew a breath, hand brushing the grip of his sidearm. Then he stepped out into the snow, Shadow bounding ahead, paws leaving a clean trail toward the silent house. The porch groaned under Ethan's boots. He knocked once, twice. No answer. Sheriff's Department, he called. Anyone home? Only the moan of wind replied. Shadow pressed against the doornose, working furiously. He let out a low growl. Ethan tried the handle. Unlocked. The door creaked open, stale air rushing out, musty layered with the faint tang of mildew. Inside the living room was dim curtains drawn tight. Toys lay scattered across the floor, covered in dust. Shadow padded in first body, low ears, sharp. Ethan followed flashlight, sweeping the shadows. Each room was silent furniture, coated with neglect, but here and there were traces of life. A cup on the counter, half a loaf of bread hardened with age, a coat draped across a chair. Then Shadow froze at a doorway. He stiffened, nose-working tail rigid. He glanced back at Ethan, then forward again, growl deepening. Ethan's stomach clenched. He raised the flashlight. At the far corner of the bedroom sat a small figure. A little girl, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped tight around a threadbare teddy bear. Sophie. Her eyes were the same as in the Polaroid, hollow, heavy, carrying silence like a shield. She didn't flinch at the light, didn't move, as Ethan stepped forward slowly, carefully. "Hey there," he said softly, lowering his voice. "My name's Ethan. This is Shadow. We're here to help." She didn't answer. Her lips pressed tighter against her knees, her arms tightening around the bear. Shadow moved closer, steps, slow, posture, low. He paused just feet away, then sat tail sweeping once across the dusty floor. His ears flicked his gaze calm. For a long moment, Sophie stared at him. Then slowly she reached out one small hand, trembling, and brushed his fur. Her lips parted. A sound broke from her throat, not words at first, but a cracked whisper. Then clear enough to echo in the silence. "Dog." Ethan swallowed hard. His chest ached at the fragile miracle of it. "You're safe now, Sophie," he murmured. "We've got you." Shadow pressed closer, nuzzling her hand, and the little girl clung to him as though anchoring herself back to the world. The farmhouse sagged against the gray sky like a memory that refused to fade. Its wooden boards leaned inward, windows cracked, and clouded roofline bent from decades of winter storms. Snow clung to the gutters in long, icy teeth. From the driveway it looked almost empty, another forgotten relic along Morgan County's back roads. But Ethan Ward knew better. He stood at the threshold, flashlight in one hand, the other resting on the grip of his sidearm. Shadow moved low at his heel nose, twitching ears angled sharply forward. The shepherd's body was tense, reading the silence with instinct Ethan had learned to trust without question. "Easy, boy," Ethan whispered. The door was already ajar, hinges warped from weather. He pushed it open, the wood groaning like a reluctant witness. Inside, dust swirled in the narrow beam of his light, each step kicking echoes off the sagging floorboards. The living room was a graveyard of old furniture. A sofa with stuffing spilling from its seams. A coffee table covered in rings from cups long since emptied. Children's toys scattered in corners, their colors dulled by time. It looked less like a home abandoned and more like one interrupted mid-breath. Shadow sniffed the air, tail rigid. Then he stopped near a patch of carpet darkened with stains. His growl rose low, vibrating in the hollow quiet. Ethan's eyes swept the room, landing on a trap door near the far wall, its outline faint, but visible beneath the dust. A chain hung from a rusty latch. The shepherd padded forward, sniffed the seam, then glanced back at Ethan with a sharp bark. "All right," Ethan muttered. "Let's see." He knelt, tugging the latch. The trapdoor creaked, hinges resisting, then gave way with a sharp snap. A rush of stale air rose up, damp, tinged with mildew, and beneath it something sourer. The smell of confinement. Ethan's beam cut into the darkness below, revealing a narrow staircase sinking into shadow. He drew a breath, steadying himself. Stay close. Shadow descended, first paws quiet on the steps, his body framed in the beam of light. Ethan followed each creak of wood beneath his boots, like a warning. The basement was little more than stone and shadow. Walls sweated with damp floor, cracked with frost. In the far corner sat a small figure, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped tight around a worn teddy bear. Sophie. Her hair hung in tangled strands across her face, her eyes wide and hollow. She didn't move as the light fell across her, didn't blink, didn't speak. The silence clung to her like armor, but Shadow didn't hesitate. The shepherd padded across the concrete body, low tail sweeping once in a gesture of calm. He stopped a few feet away, sat, and waited. Sophie's eyes flicked toward him. Her fingers tightened around the teddy bear, then loosened. Slowly, with trembling effort, she reached out one hand. Her fingertips brushed the fur along Shadow's neck, and then her lips parted. A sound cracked through the silence, weak but clear. Dog. The single word echoed louder than a shout. Ethan felt it in his chest, sharp and aching. His throat tightened. Shadow pressed closer, nuzzling her hand gently. Sophie clung to him, burying her face in his fur, her small shoulders shaking. Ethan lowered his flashlight, his voice soft. Good girl. You're safe now. But then movement stirred at the far wall. From the shadows, a woman emerged. Her hair was streaked with gray, though she couldn't have been more than 50. Her dress hung in tatters, fabric stained and torn. Her hands trembling as she clutched the wall for balance. Her eyes, wild, unfocused, darted between Ethan and the girl. Don't take her, the woman rasped, voice hoarse from disuse. She's mine. Ethan straightened, hand tightening on his holster. Ma'am, I'm Officer Ward. This girl needs medical care. What's your name? The woman's mouth twisted as though the question were foreign. Margaret. Margaret Hale. She stays here. Safe. Away from them. Her eyes flicked to the trap door above, then back to Sophie. Ethan's stomach sank. How long has she been here? Margaret shook her head violently, clutching her ears. Don't ask. Don't listen. They'll come back if you listen. Shadow rose slightly, body bristling, but stayed by Sophie's side. The little girl clung to his collar, burying herself in his warmth, as though he were the only steady thing in the room. Ethan kept his voice calm. Margaret, no one's coming. Just me and Shadow. But this child, she needs to leave here. She needs help. Margaret's hands shook, her eyes filling with tears. I tried, she whispered. I tried to keep her safe. They always take them away. I thought if I kept her here quiet, they couldn't find her. Generational pain echoed in her words, thick with years of fear. Ethan took a slow step forward. You wanted to protect her. But silence isn't safety. She's losing herself. Margaret's gaze wavered. Her lips trembled. Then she dropped against the wall, sliding down to the floor, her sobs breaking the stale air. The extraction was slow, careful. Ethan carried Sophie up the narrow stairs, her arms still wrapped around Shadow's neck, the shepherd climbing alongside them like a bodyguard, unwilling to break contact. Margaret followed, stumbling, murmuring fragments of apologies and warnings, her eyes never leaving the child. Outside, the air was knife-sharp, but clean compared to the basement. Sophie squinted against the light, curling tighter against Shadow's side. Ethan radioed for backup. This is Ward. I've located the child alive. Female approximately 6. She's nonverbal, except for one word. Request immediate medical assistance at 14 Morgan Road. also bringing in an adult female unstable mental state. Possible psychiatric hold. Copy that, ward dispatch replied. EMS en route. Minutes later, flashing lights pierced the gray. Paramedics rushed forward, lifting Sophie gently, wrapping her in warm blankets. She whimpered once, eyes wide, but relaxed only when Shadow pressed close, his muzzle brushing her hand. She won't let go of the dog, one medic remarked. Then let him ride along, Ethan said firmly. They didn't argue. Margaret Hale was led gently to another vehicle, her protests rising, then dissolving into exhausted silence. Her words were fragments, warnings of Shadow's voices, memories twisted by years of fear. Ethan watched as the doors shut, his chest heavy. At the hospital, doctors worked carefully over Sophie. They whispered of malnutrition, of stress, of the long road ahead. But in the midst of it, the girl clung to Shadow, whispering the same fragile word again and again. Dog. Dog. It was the only bridge she had left, and Shadow carried her across it. Ethan sat outside the room, elbows on his knees, listening. Each repetition of that word was a fracture line, healing a spark, reigniting. Maya Torres arrived later, her expression tight. I heard. Another child. Not just a child, Ethan said quietly. He handed her the Polaroid, now creased from travel. Someone knew about her. Sent this to Shadow. Knew exactly where to push us. Maya studied it, brow furrowing. Then this isn't random. Someone's feeding you leads. Someone who wants these kids found. Ethan nodded slowly. But why us? Why Shadow? The question lingered heavy between them. Inside the ward, Sophie whispered, dog again, her voice fragile, but alive. Shadow stayed by her bed, his head resting on the blankets, eyes steady as though he'd known her all his life. Ethan watched them unease, knotting his chest. Margaret Hale's words haunted him. They always take them away. This wasn't just about one child. This was about many. And now he knew Morgan County was only the beginning. Ethan Ward leaned against the doorway, arms folded. He'd spent years in law enforcement, but something about this child lingered heavier than most cases. The Polaroid had been more than a clue, it had been a summons. Someone had wanted Sophie found. And now here she was, fragile, silent, tethered to the world, only through the dog by her side. The click of shoes echoed down the hall. Naomi Price, a social worker with the state, approached carrying a folder tucked under her arm. Her coat still held flakes of snow, her dark curls damp from the weather. She gave Ethan a tired but purposeful nod. Officer Ward, she greeted. I've been reviewing Sophie's case. There's something you need to hear. Ethan straightened. Go on. Naomi opened the folder, sliding out a document. Her name isn't Sophie Hale. That was given later. Legally, her birth certificate lists her as Sophia Cross, Mother Amelia Cross, 24 years old at the time of birth. Ethan's brow furrowed. Cross, where's the mother now? Naomi's eyes dropped. That's the mystery. Amelia disappeared 3 years ago. Neighbors claimed she left town in the middle of the night. Some believed she overdosed. Others thought she fled an abusive partner. Her case was filed as missing adult, presumed dead. But no body was ever recovered. Ethan glanced at the little girl asleep in the bed, clutching Shadow's fur in her dreams. His jaw tightened. So the mother's still out there. Somewhere. Naomi nodded. That's what I intend to find out. The search took weeks. Naomi dug through old case files, tracking bank statements, scattered witness reports, phone records that ended abruptly. Most led nowhere. But then a lead surfaced. A women's shelter in Colorado Springs had listed an Amelia C. 3 years back. She'd stayed for 2 months, then vanished again. The shelter's director recalled her vividly young, quiet, haunted eyes, carrying the scars of someone who'd lived under control for too long. Ethan and Shadow made the trip west, snow stretching endless across the plains, until the mountains rose jagged against the horizon. Colorado Springs bustled under winter skies, streets alive with traffic and distant peaks looming like watchmen. The shelter sat on a quiet block, brick walls, softened by murals painted by the women who had stayed there. Images of birds in flight, open hands, rising suns. Inside, warmth radiated from the walls, the scent of fresh bread and coffee drifting from the kitchen. The director, an older woman named Helen, met them with a firm handshake. Amelia Cross. Yes, I remember her. She came here broken, spoke little, jumped at every sound. She told me once she had a daughter, but said she lost her to the system. She believed no one would ever find her. Ethan exchanged a glance with Shadow. The shepherd's ears pricked, eyes intent as though he understood the gravity of the words. Do you know where she went after she left? Ethan asked. Helen hesitated. There's a clinic outside town, counseling and rehabilitation. Some of our women end up there. You might try. The clinic sat nestled in the foothills, a low building surrounded by pines heavy with snow. Its windows glowed warmly against the dusk, a fragile beacon in the cold. Ethan walked the halls slowly, Shadow pacing at his side. The staff guided him to a quiet wing where long-term patients stayed. The air was hushed, broken only by the murmur of voices and the soft squeak of nurses' shoes. And then he saw her. Amelia Cross sat by a window, her frame thin beneath a sweater, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her hair, once dark, now held strands of gray despite her youth. Her eyes stared out at the mountains distant, lost somewhere Ethan couldn't see. The nurse spoke softly. She doesn't talk much. Not anymore. But she listens. Ethan stepped closer, heart heavy. Amelia. Her head turned slightly, eyes flicking to him. A flicker of recognition or just reflex? He crouched, laying the Polaroid gently on the table beside her. The photo of Sophie clutching her teddy bear, her eyes sad and hollow. For the first time, Amelia's face cracked. Her lips parted, a tremor running through her hands. She reached out slowly, touching the photo, as though it might vanish. That's her, she whispered, voice raw with disuse. My baby. Ethan's throat tightened. She's alive, she's safe, and she wants her mother. Amelia's eyes filled, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Her hands shook as she pressed the photo to her chest. Arrangements were made, quietly, cautiously. The clinic staff warned Ethan and Naomi that reunions of this kind could overwhelm both mother and child. Trauma left cracks, and sometimes even love struggled to bridge them. But Ethan believed otherwise. He had seen Sophie whisper her first word in months to Shadow. He had seen Amelia's silence break at the sight of her daughter's photograph. The bond was still there, waiting. The reunion took place in a therapy room at the clinic, its walls painted soft green, a couch on one side, toys neatly stacked on shelves. A window overlooked the snowy pines, light spilling across the floor. Ethan stood near the door, Shadow by his side. Naomi stayed close to Amelia, who trembled as she clutched the photograph, her breath uneven. Sophie was brought in, gently wrapped in a warm coat, teddy bear in hand. The moment the little girl saw her mother, she froze. The bear slipped from her fingers. "Mommy," she whispered. Amelia's knees gave out. She dropped to the floor, arms open, tears streaming unchecked. "Sophie." Her voice cracked, breaking into sobs. "My baby. My sweet baby." Sophie bolted forward, colliding with her mother's embrace. Amelia clutched her, desperately burying her face in her daughter's hair, rocking back and forth as though to convince herself it was real. "I thought I lost you forever." Amelia wept. "I thought he'd taken you from me." Sophie's small arms tightened around her neck. "Dog found me," she whispered. "Dog brought me back." Amelia looked up through tears. Shadow sat close, head tilted, amber eyes steady. Sophie reached for him, pressing her hand to his fur. "This dog," Amelia breathed. "This angel." For the first time in years, Sophie's laughter rang out, fragile, fleeting, but real. She nestled between her mother and Shadow, both arms tangled in their warmth. The room was silent, but for the sound of their sobs and the muffled thud of Ethan's heart. He swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in his eyes. Naomi touched her sleeve to her cheek, whispering, "This is what survival looks like." The days that followed weren't easy. Therapy sessions tested Amelia's resolve, while Sophie clung to her mother with a desperation that bordered on fear of separation. But slowly, the cracks began to mend. Sophie spoke more, not to everyone, but to Amelia and Shadow. Simple words at first. "Mommy bear home." Each syllable was a victory. Amelia grew stronger, her voice steadier, her posture firmer. She began to smile again, though always through tears. "She's the only reason I kept breathing," she admitted one night. "I thought if I could just stay alive long enough, maybe she'd find her way back to me." And now she has. Ethan watched from a distance, silent. He didn't need to insert himself into their healing. His role had been to find them, to open the door. Now the rest was theirs to walk through. But one question never left his mind. Who had sent the Polaroid? Late one evening, Ethan sat in his cruiser outside the clinic, snow drifting in lazy circles. He pulled the envelope from the glove box, the one addressed not to him, but to Shadow. He ran his thumb across the scrawled handwriting. Someone out there had known about Sophie. Someone who had eyes where the law had none. And whoever they weren't finished. Shadow lifted his head from the seat, eyes glowing faintly in the dashlight. Ethan exhaled, muttering softly. "Looks like we've got more ghosts to chase, partner." The shepherd's tail thumped once, a quiet drumbeat of certainty. Inside the clinic, Amelia held Sophie as the girl drifted into sleep, whispering lullabies she thought she'd forgotten. Outside, the winter pressed close, silent, and waiting. For one fragile moment, hope had returned. The envelope had been sitting in Ethan Ward's glove compartment for weeks, sealed again, after he had removed Sophie's Polaroid. He hadn't thrown it away, not because of the photograph inside, but because of something else. Something he hadn't noticed at first. That night, as Shadow lay stretched across the living room rug, Ethan sat with the envelope beneath the warm glow of a single lamp. He turned it over again and again, fingers brushing the worn paper. At a certain angle, the light caught faint marks, impressions pressed into the fiber. Not ink, not print. Almost invisible. Ethan fetched a pencil, shading lightly across the surface. Slowly letters emerged, carved shallow into the paper by whoever had handled it before. Justice for the silent. The words appeared stark against the paper, ghost-like but deliberate. Ethan stared, the phrase echoing in his chest. It wasn't just a tip. It was a calling card. Justice for the silent, he murmured. So that's who's been sending these. Shadow lifted his head, amber eyes catching the lamplight. He gave a low whine, as if agreeing that the name mattered. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the words burning in his mind. A group, an individual. Whoever it was, they had eyes on children the system had failed. And they weren't reaching out to the sheriff's office. They weren't reaching out to social services. They had chosen Shadow. The next morning, Ethan brought the envelope to the precinct. Maya Torres studied the faint words under magnification brow furrowed. You're saying someone's organizing this? That there's a group with its own name? Looks that way, Ethan replied. Justice for the silent, Maya repeated the phrase, tasting strange in her mouth. Could be a vigilante group. Could be one person with a typewriter. Hard to say. They knew about Sophie, Ethan said firmly. They knew where she was, what condition she was in. That's not random. That's targeted. Maya glanced at him. So, what you're going to follow breadcrumbs from some underground network that's dangerous, Ward? Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. What's more dangerous is ignoring them. If they're right about Sophie, they might be right about others. Maya hesitated, then slid a file across the desk. Funny you should say that. Overnight we got an alert from Kansas State Police. A child missing for 6 months, presumed trafficked. Name's Emma Lowell, 6 years old. Vanished from her grandparents' farm outside Wichita. No ransom note, no trace. Case went cold. Ethan's pulse quickened, and Maya tapped the file. 2 days ago, the sheriff's office in Kansas received an unmarked package. Inside, another Polaroid. Same style as the one you got. Same handwriting on the back. Just 3 words. She's still alive. Ethan's jaw tightened, and they dismissed it. They logged it, but with no corroborating evidence. It's buried under a dozen other cases. Maya fixed him with a steady gaze. But when I saw the Polaroid, I thought of Sophie, thought of Shadow. And then your envelope shows this signature. She pointed at the words. Justice for the silent. The room went quiet. Even Shadow, lying at Ethan's feet, lifted his head and gave a low huff. This isn't coincidence, Ethan said. This group's moving across state lines. They're leaving trails for someone willing to follow. And you think that's you? Maya asked softly. Ethan glanced down at Shadow, who stared back at him steady as stone. Not just me. Us. By afternoon, Ethan and Shadow were on the road again, cruiser cutting south toward Kansas. Snow thinned into flatlands, the horizon stretching wide skies tinted with fading light. Each mile hummed with possibility, but also with unease. At a gas station outside Salina, Ethan unfolded the Kansas file, spreading photos across the dashboard. Emma Lowell smiled from a school portrait, gap-toothed grin freckles across her nose, hair tied in 2 bright braids. Another photo showed the farmhouse she'd disappeared from wide fields, a sagging barn fences split by age. 6 months gone. Statistically, the odds were grim. But if Justice for the Silent was right, then Emma wasn't gone. Not yet. Shadow shifted in the passenger seat, nose pressed against the window, breath fogging the glass. Ethan reached over, scratching behind his ear. You ready for this, partner? The shepherd gave one firm wag of his tail. The Lowell farmhouse sat lonely against the Kansas dusk fields, brown and brittle around it. The barn loomed nearby, its doors creaking in the wind. Ethan parked, stepping into the chill air, Shadow bounding at his side. An older couple met him on the porch. Emma's grandparents. Their faces were etched with grief, their voices trembling as they described the night she vanished. She was here in bed, the grandmother whispered. We woke up to her window open. No sign of struggle, no prints, no nothing. Just gone. The grandfather's eyes burned with helpless anger. The sheriff searched for weeks. Dogs, helicopters. Found tracks near the road but lost them in the woods. Everyone said she was gone. Ethan showed them the Polaroid. Their hands shook as they held it, tears spilling. "That's her," the grandmother whispered. "That's our Emma." Ethan's chest tightened. The photo showed Emma thinner, her braids messy, her smile gone. She clutched a ragged blanket, her eyes hollow. And on the back, the handwriting again. She's still alive. That night, Ethan spread the photos across a motel desk, the Polaroid at the center. He circled patterns on a notepad, dates, places, distances. Sophie in Morgan County, Emma in Kansas. Both delivered through the same method, with the same anonymous hand guiding him. Shadow lay across the bed, ears twitching, eyes half closed, but alert. "Who are they?" Ethan murmured. "This justice for the silent. How many kids are they watching? How many cases do they know about that we don't?" He ran his fingers over the phrase again, carved faint into the envelope. A name, a promise, maybe a warning. Shadow stirred, shifting closer, laying his head against Ethan's knee. His eyes glowed steady, unflinching. Ethan exhaled, steadying himself. "Whoever they are, wherever they're leading us, it's bigger than Wyoming now. Bigger than one mother, one child. This is a network, and if kids are caught in it, we're not stopping." The shepherd thumped his tail, once the sound firm, resolute. Ethan stared at the Polaroid one last time, before switching off the lamp. The room sank into darkness, but the phrase burned bright in his mind. Justice for the silent. Snow still clung to the edges of Ethan Ward's porch when he found the envelope. It lay there like the others had, silent, and waiting no footprints in the yard to mark its arrival. Shadow discovered it first, padding toward the door at dawn nose, pressed against the crack, ears high. By the time Ethan opened it, the shepherd was already staring down at the paper as if he knew its weight. The handwriting was the same, steady, deliberate, anonymous. Inside lay a single folded sheet of paper, no Polaroid this time. Just words printed in stark black ink. Ruby wasn't the last. "The next one is in Utah. Her name is Chloe." Ethan read it twice, then a third time, his stomach tightening. Ruby. The Kansas girl who never came home. Now another Chloe. A name, a place, a warning. He glanced down. Shadow's amber eyes met his own, sharp and unblinking. Utah Ethan muttered. "Looks like we're heading west, partner." Green River sat cradled in the Utah desert, a town of sandstone and dust, its streets stretching beneath towering red cliffs. By the time Ethan and Shadow rolled in the winter storm of Wyoming, had been traded for brittle winds and skies the color of copper. Detective Ivy Callahan met them outside the small sheriff's office. She was tall, mid-30s, with hair pulled back in a severe knot, and a badge clipped to her belt. Her handshake was firm, her eyes weary but sharp. "You must be Ward," she said, sizing him up. "And this is the famous Shadow." Shadow stood steady at Ethan's side, tail ears alert. "That's us," Ethan replied. "You've got a case." 6-year-old. Chloe Grant. Ivy's jaw tightened. "She's been gone for 3 weeks. Family reported her missing from her foster placement. House was locked, no signs of forced entry, just a teddy bear left on the porch. We've been chasing leads into the ground, but nothing sticks." Ethan handed her the letter. "Then you'll want to see this." Her eyes narrowed as she read. "Ruby wasn't the last. The next one is in Utah. Her name is Chloe." She looked up sharply. "Who's sending you these?" "That's the question," Ethan said grimly. They call themselves Justice for the Silent, but so far every lead they've sent has been real. Ivy exhaled slowly. So we treat it like gospel, until proven otherwise. Ethan agreed. The search began in Chloe's foster home. A small clapboard house sat at the edge of Green River, its porch still decorated with Christmas lights that hadn't been lit in weeks. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old coffee. Ethan crouched in Chloe's room, studying the details drawings taped to the wall, half-colored books on the desk shoes, lined neatly by the bed. Everything looked untouched, staged almost. Shadow padded slowly through the room, nose pressed to the floor. He paused by the window, sniffing the sill, then gave a sharp bark. Ethan moved to his side. "What is it?" Scratch marks lined the wood, faint, desperate, small fingernail grooves pressed into the paint. She tried to get out. Ethan whispered. Ivy cursed under her breath. Whoever took her knew how to make it look clean. Shadow growled low, pressing his nose against the frame again, then turned sharply, heading out the door down the hall into the yard. He followed the fence line, nose close to the ground, before freezing at the back gate. Ethan saw it, two faint tire tracks pressed into the dirt, nearly erased by wind. Truck Ethan muttered. Heavy. Dual tires. Ivy squinted. This town's crawling with old pickups. Half the county drives one, but not all lead west. Ethan's eyes followed the faint line of tracks vanishing into the red desert. The trail took them miles outside town, where sandstone buttes rose jagged against the horizon. Shadow led the way, paws steady on the cracked earth, his body alive with purpose. As the sun sank, they came upon it, a cluster of buildings long abandoned, their wood bleached white by the sun. A cross leaned crooked at the entrance, weathered letters still faintly visible. Red Hollow Sanctuary. A religious compound, Ivy said, her voice hard. Shut down 20 years ago after financial fraud. No one's been here since. Shadow growled low, his body rigid. Ethan's gut tightened. No one except whoever took Chloe. They approached slowly, weapons-drawn flashlights cutting through the darkening halls. The sanctuary smelled of rot and dust. Its pews cracked hymnals scattered across the floor. In the chapel, stained glass windows were shattered colored shards strewn like broken prayers. Shadow tugged sharply on the leash, pulling them toward a stairwell that descended beneath the chapel. The air grew colder with each step, the silence thicker. At the bottom, Ethan's beam swept across a heavy wooden door. Rusted bolts sealed it shut. Shadow barked once, sharply, tail stiff. Chloe's here, Ethan whispered. Ivy moved to pry at the bolts. Together they forced the door open with a groan that echoed like thunder. Inside the basement was dim lit only by a single bulb swinging from a wire. Mattresses lay scattered across the floor, blankets, torn toys broken. Against the far wall sat a small figure, knees pulled to her chest. Chloe. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks hollow. Her small hands clutched a ragged piece of cloth. She stared at them with wide, frightened eyes. Ethan lowered his weapon immediately. Chloe. My name's Ethan. This is Ivy. And that's Shadow. We're here to take you home. She flinched at his voice, but froze when Shadow stepped forward. The shepherd moved slowly, body low, tail sweeping gently. He sat a few feet away, amber eyes steady. For a long moment, Chloe didn't move. Then, hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand. Shadow pressed his muzzle into her palm. Her lips parted, a breath escaping like a prayer. Dog. Ethan's chest tightened, the word hitting him with déjà vu. Sophie's first word. Another child, another silence broken only by this dog. He crouched low, voice steady. "You're safe now, Chloe. We've got you." Ivy moved carefully, wrapping Chloe in a blanket. The girl clung to Shadow as they guided her out, refusing to let go of his fur. Back outside under the red cliffs, the night wind howled like an unanswered hymn. Chloe was safe, alive. But the basement of Red Hollow had told a darker story. Too many mattresses, too many toys, too much evidence of children who had been there before. Ethan stared back at the building, bile rising in his throat. This wasn't just for her. This place has been used for others. Ivy's face was pale. Jaw clenched. We're looking at a network. Trafficking. Organized, deliberate. And Red Hollow's just one piece. Ethan's hands curled into fists. Justice for the silent knew. That's why they sent us here. He looked down at Shadow, who stood watchful beside Chloe, her small hands still tangled in his fur. The shepherd met his gaze, unblinking, as though reminding him of the road ahead. Ethan exhaled slowly, the desert wind cutting sharp. This doesn't end here. There are more kids out there, more places like this, and someone's making sure we know where to look. Shadow pressed against his leg, silent, but certain. Ethan glanced once more at Chloe, at the fragile way she clung to the only being she trusted. His chest ached with both relief and dread. The girl was safe tonight. But the shadows were deeper than he had imagined, and as the desert stars burned overhead, Ethan understood he and Shadow were no longer chasing cases. They were walking into a war,